I'm Barbara Schneider, President of AERA. I'm pleased to welcome all of you here in Philadelphia and the many more watching via the internet to the AERA 2014 Presidential Distinguished Lecture. And for those of you on Twitter, the unique session hashtag is AERA Improve. I like that, Tony, AERA Improve for this session. I'm thrilled to introduce this year's distinguished speaker, Anthony Bryk, President of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, who we all know as Tony. Tony is the Carnegie Foundation's 9th president and one of the country's most renowned educational researchers whose reputation certainly exceeds our national borders. At Carnegie, he is leading groundbreaking work focused on improving teaching and learning, especially within community colleges and in the subject areas of mathematics and science. For the past 5 years, the Foundation has been pioneering a fundamentally new vision for research and development that joins the discipline of improvement science with the capacity of networks to foster innovation and social learning. As a member of the National Academy of Education, Tony was appointed by President Obama to the National Board for Education Sciences in 2010, and in 2011 he was elected as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, just a wee bit of history. His book, Catholic Schools and the Common Good, is considered a classic in the Library of Education Sociology, and his newer volumes reflect a deep interest in bringing scholarship to bear on improving schooling. And one of those more recent books was Trust in Schools, and Tony was maybe now not so much famous at the time because this was a decade long in the cooker, that I think that we both consider well worth the effort. The ideas in the Trust book have had a lasting effect on later directions each of us has taken in promoting school reform. One of Tony's hallmark contributions to education policy and practice was the creation of the Consortium on Chicago School Research, which brings together research groups producing a range of studies to advance and assess urban school reform. Having been there at the onset, I remember well the passion, careful thought, and scientific rigor that represented Tony's vision on how to establish an organization whose members included social scientists, urban school personnel, policy groups, teacher educators, and social media for the explicit purpose of initiating a new direction for school improvement based on evidence and relevance. In the AERA Distinguished Lecture, Tony will discuss joining improvement science to network communities. 6 principles of improvement are currently guiding the Carnegie Foundation's new directions and vision for research and development. Tony's lecture will illustrate these principles and how they serve both large-scale policy initiatives and the autonomous efforts of teachers and schools. This has really been one of my true pleasures to be able to introduce to you one of my dear friends and part of what was at one time the In and Out partnership. So let me please introduce Tony Bryk.
Good morning. Let me get this up here a little bit out of the way. Thank you, Barbara, for this opportunity to give this address this morning. And also thank you for many, many wonderful years of terrific colleagueship. Trust in Schools would never have existed except for this wonderful partner in doing the work. To begin, I'd like to take you back to where I was when I first arrived at the Carnegie Foundation in late 2008. As I looked out on the, got a problem here. Let me see. All right, there we go. As I looked down on the landscape of public education in America, we were operating, I thought, in truly extraordinary times, confronting extraordinary aspirations for our public school system. We had the Common Core beginning to take shape, which was directing us to deeper learning for all students. We were now living in an age where resources were fixed and in many cases declining, and so we were asking our educational systems to become much more efficient in how they did their work. And far too many of our students were still walking out the door, not completing their education. We were failing to engage them in this most important endeavor. Working on any one of these problems, strengthening student engagement, making institutions more generally effective, increasing their efficiency, would be a huge undertaking. The task we were called to now is to do all three of these at the same time. This is an extraordinary undertaking, and it struck me that we could not possibly accomplish these triple aims of education without a much more vibrant research and development infrastructure focused very explicitly on improving practices in our nation's schools and colleges. But what exactly would this look like? Well, inspiration, sometimes how to see a complex problem through fresh eyes, sometimes arises in unusual places. Late in 2008, I was invited to a conference by Jim Kulmus, who's sitting right here, and had the opportunity to meet for the first time Dr. Donald Bryk, who was then president and founder of the Institute for Healthcare Quality Improvement. Don talked about an organization that had been in operation for 20 years that was actually living the ideas, doing the kind of work in healthcare quality improvement that we had been speculating about ought to occur in education. Don subsequently invited us to visit IHI to see firsthand how this work was being done. Little did I know that on that first visit, he was opening the door to a most extraordinary and high-performing organization. At the conclusion of the first visit to IHI, Don shared with me a copy of a book called Best Practice by Charles Kenny. The book is a narrative account of the emergence of improvement research in healthcare going back about 25 years. Going back that time, there were a few extraordinary leaders in healthcare who recognized the challenges confronting their field. These leaders brought the discipline and culture of quality improvement, which was originally pioneered in Japanese industry, and then they transformed it to work on the complex enterprise that is modern healthcare institutions. Under their influence, medical institutions have reduced harm, saved lives, enhanced patients' experiences, and controlled costs. Their efforts to promote a system where continuous improvement is what we do here became our inspiration. At several points in Kenny's text, one could easily substitute the words teachers and students for doctors and patients and swear you are reading about an educational conversation. We became convinced that if healthcare could learn useful lessons from studying industrial quality improvement on the job floor at places like Toyota, then there was a good chance that educators could learn something of value by studying them in turn. And so we became serious students of the work of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and then eventually, more broadly, other quality improvement organizations in that field. We looked at how they organized their work, why and how they had come to do the work as they did. We have engaged in several of their professional development training programs and consider them our mentors as we've sought to adapt the principles, tools, and improvement routines that have been so successfully employed in healthcare. Along the way, we've come to think about ourselves as akin to a new breed of bird that I call the Analogical Scavenger. That's actually a picture of a turkey vulture, and we have them flying around over the foundation, if for anybody who's really interested in what that bird is. I say analogical scavengers because we're constantly looking to other fields that share a concern about improving practice and that have made some significant progress, and then go study how they do it. We look at these places deeply. We try to reflect on commonalities, but we also attend to scrutinizing critical differences. And the latter is especially important whenever you move to transport ideas and practices from one context into another. You have to constantly ask the question, how do these ideas fit? Where are adaptations needed? And how do you discern what the most appropriate adaptations might look like? So gradually, we were building a set of ideas and tools and practices that seemed like it might be a better way for educational R&D to proceed on the work of improvement in education. But this led us to a second strategy. We had these ideas, but could we actually make them work? So this led us to an attempt to learn by doing. We would initiate 2 networked improvement communities and join together with them as learning partners, learning how to improve. Let me briefly describe the two networked improvement communities we initiated, because I will draw from their experiences throughout the remainder of my talk. The first of the networked improvement communities is organized around the extraordinary high failure rates in developmental mathematics courses in community colleges. One of the first principles of a networked improvement community is it's organized around a very specific problem to solve. That is a very specific problem to solve. The goal was, can we work with colleges to dramatically increase the success of these students to and through college-level math in 1 year of instruction? If you don't get through this gate, your opportunity to transfer to a 4-year institution is foreclosed. You cannot qualify for many occupational and technical preparation programs. This is literally the gate where aspirations go to die for many of our nation's students. So that's the first one. Second and smaller of the networked improvement communities is focused on the problem of the weak and incoherent supports by which we bring individuals into our public school settings, typically fail to support them well to learn to teach, and maintain this revolving door where they're back out in a few years. So the goal in this one was, can districts learn how to support new teachers better? Or to put it simply, how to get new teachers better, faster, and hold on to them. That became the focus of the second networked improvement community. As our work proceeded in these 2 networked communities, we began to find fellow travelers also engaged in improvement work in education, sometimes in unusual places, and also in other social welfare domains. While they might use somewhat different terminology, slightly different tools, and obviously working on different kinds of problems, we shared with them a commonality, a belief that systematic inquiry on practice carried out with practitioners could accelerate learning to improve. So this then gave rise to the third strategy that defines the work of the Foundation now, our efforts at building a community around educational improvement. This led to our first national summit, which we had last month. We now offer a number of workshops which open up these ideas to others, and we're in the process of developing an open online course which will make these materials even more broadly available going forward. Before proceeding further in my talk about networked improvement communities, I'd like to take a step back and share a bit of my understanding of where we have come from in order to set a better course for where I think we should be headed. So I'm going to offer a somewhat selective history of improvement ideas that have sought to move to large scale in U.S. schools over the last 2 decades. All right. Start with the small high school case. By the middle of the 1990s, a major educational problem had come into focus. Many policy advocates, as well as reformers, had concluded that U.S. high schools were just simply too large. The comprehensive high school was failing many of our nation's students, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Small high schools were seen as the answer. These would be places where faculty and students would know each other well, where common bonds would form around shared academic work, and where strong moral purpose would anchor human activity. Visionary leaders at places like Central Park East and Urban Academy and other small schools offered stunning examples of what such learning environments could be. Combined with these compelling stories was a growing body of research showing that smaller high schools offered significant benefits, including better student attendance, lower dropout rates, improved school climate and safety, and stronger reports about faculty work satisfaction. This idea picked up steam when the Gates Foundation committed some $2 billion to promoting the dissolution of large high schools and the creation of small schools. The scope and pace of change was breathtaking. Some 2,600 new small schools opened in 45 states and the District of Columbia. While the number of small schools grew at an astounding rate, so did the problems. By the late fall of 2008, the Gates Foundation came to acknowledge what many others had already concluded. New small high schools were not the panacea that reformers had hoped. Another promising idea had failed to deliver, even though we've subsequently learned that some of these new small schools have actually been quite successful. Overall, the movement failed to deliver on its expectations. Looking back now, critical problems emerged early on in this initiative. Only a small number of educators had ever worked in a small high school, and even fewer of them had ever tried to start one. And even fewer of those had taken on the far more challenging task of transforming a very large dysfunctional high school into a multiplex like Austin. Equally problematic were the on-the-ground politics of change. Many school staff were resistant to the small school idea. They saw this as just one more instance of change being imposed from outside by others who knew little about the conditions under which they actually worked. And one more instance in a long history of externally imposed reforms that simply were not well thought through. Most significant, many of the high schools that grew out of the Gates Initiative developed in quite different ways from the exemplars they were intended to replicate. The exemplar schools typically started with a small select group of faculty. They grew a grade each year over time. They learned by trial and error, changing and improving as they went along. In essence, the leaders of those exemplary small schools brought a design development orientation to the task of new school creation. In contrast, school faculties that had no prior experience in school redesign were charged with reinventing themselves, often in less than a year. There was little opportunity to start small, fail, learn, and iterate towards success. Rapid, large-scale change was being called for under conditions least likely to succeed. While all this was going on, educators across the country were confronting common challenges and trying to solve the complex problems of bringing new small high schools into existence. Many learned valuable lessons that could have propelled the ongoing redesign of high schools toward a better future. The problem is they were doing these things largely on their own. There was no organized system to capture the learning, refine it, and transform it into a collective force accelerating wider scale improvements. That many small schools struggled and some failed, especially early on in an initiative like this, is not surprising. This was an ambitious and novel reform, and much of the practical knowledge required to make it work was unknown. That failures were likely to occur under these circumstances is not a fatal flaw. That the field failed to learn quickly from these failures was and still is. Over and over again, over the past 2 decades, change efforts have swept rapidly across public education, with little real knowledge as to how or even whether it's possible to effect the improvements envisioned by the reform advocates. When reformers focused attention on weaknesses in in-service professional development, for example, a whole new organizational role, the instructional coach, was introduced into schools. I don't know why it's beeping, but my apologies. What coaches were actually needed to do and was largely unspecified, and the requisite organizational conditions for them to carry out this work was also left unspecified. When reformers recognized the importance of principal leadership, significant investments followed on intensive principal development programs. We exhorted principals to become instructional leaders, even though the demands on their time were already excessive, and few or no modifications were introduced to deal with the problems of time. The recent introduction of formal teacher evaluation protocols has just further amplified these problems and stress. When policymakers were unsatisfied with the rate of school improvement, high-stakes accountability schemes were introduced. Unintended consequences abounded. The incidence of test score cheating accelerated, and selected students were ignored as accountability schemes directed attention towards some students and away from others. More recently, the rapid introduction of value-added methods for assessing teachers began well before the statistical properties and limits of these techniques were actually well understood when used for this purpose. Not surprisingly, a host of problems have emerged and political pushback is growing in the field. In each instance, there was a real problem to solve, and in most cases, there was the nugget of a good reform idea. Educators, however, typically did not know how to execute on these ideas. Districts and states lacked individual expertise and organizational capacity to support these changes at scale, and many policymakers ignored arguably the most important instrument for any of this to work: developing the will and agency among our nation's teachers and principals for change. Education leaders continue today along this path, believing that we must disrupt the educational system big and fast. These initiatives make extraordinary time demands on leaders as problems inevitably arise. Teachers, principals, and students are taxed too. Directives for how to engage reforms frequently change, guidance is sometimes absent, and key provisions just on occasion don't work at all. When the data is crunched, the same disappointing conclusions emerge. The press quickly to push good ideas into large-scale use rarely delivers on the outcomes promised. Effects are often small and highly variable, might work in some places, no evidence of effects in others, and on some occasions, it might even do harm. At base is a common story of going fast but learning slow. We consistently fail to appreciate what it actually takes to make some promising idea work reliably in practice. We become disappointed when dramatic positive results do not emerge, and then we just move on to the next new reform idea. This way of working should trouble all of us. For if we continue to pursue change in the ways we have always done, we're likely to continue to get what we've always gotten. Our efforts as analogical scavengers, as well as what we're now learning through our two networked improvement communities, have helped us initiate and lead us to what we think is a better way of working, a shift toward learning fast to implement well. That's the aspiration of networked improvement communities. Thank you. Standing behind simple ideas, such as making high schools smaller or teacher evaluations more rigorous, are typically a vast array of changes in how individuals are to carry out their work. We regularly underestimate how much must be learned in order to transform these ideas into functional work processes, develop new human capabilities, and enhance organizational supports for reform to take deep root. Each reform that I just mentioned sought to implement fast and wide. This strategy has failed over and over again. Moreover, such results are not peculiar to education. They are an organizational fact of life about efforts to improve productivity in large, complex institutions, the kinds of institutions that are now commonplace in our lives. Recent book by Bob Sutton and Huggy Rao, two of my former colleagues at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, have been studying this problem for over a decade across many different industries. And what we learn from this is that we are actually in good company when it comes to the problem of scaling up excellence. Their research and others across numerous sectors document that problematic outcomes ranging from defective products coming off an assembly line to hospital-induced infections are typically not the result of bad people. Improvement experts refer to these concerns about the quality of human resources as the 6% problem. Now, whether 6 is the right number, maybe in education it's a 10 or a 15% problem. But the core observation remains the same. Achieving better outcomes are fundamentally problems of organization. Advancing practical improvement demands from us a deeper understanding and a greater respect for the work that people actually undertake and the social systems in which that work occurs. Improvement science, this discipline of improvement science, which now has a 6-decade history, recognizes the vast uncertainties that leaders confront in advancing change in their institutions. It cautions humility about how much must be learned in order to convert a reform idea into new practices that produce outcomes reliably at some scale. Consequently, it adopts an iterative experimental orientation. It requires us to get down into the micro details as to how any proposed set of changes is actually supposed to work. Change ideas are tested and refined based on evidence from what is actually happening. Interestingly, when a predicted change fails to occur, some of the greatest insights come here because it forces us to think more deeply about what improvement actually entails. Previously invisible problems often manifest themselves, and the work of improvement has to sometimes tack off in new directions. Consequently, improvement research is akin to a focused learning journey. The overall goal is to develop the necessary know-how for a reform idea to spread better and faster subsequently. So, learning fast to scale and implement well subsequently. At its most fundamental level, improvement research is both better outcomes achieved and a different way of organizational living. Rather than some set of specialized studies carried out by others, learning to improve demands the active and full engagement of educators. This orientation challenges prevailing arrangements where a select group of researchers study schooling, design interventions, analyze policies, and then a vast array of others, teachers, principals, and educators, are cast as users of this research in the work they do. Improvement science, in contrast, blurs this distinction. It brings educators into regular interactions with a broad array of academic and technical experts. Participants in improvement networks form as a colleagueship of expertise, academic, technical, and clinical, all deliberately assembled to address specific work problems we seek to improve. All involved are now improvers, seeking to generate what might properly be called practice-based evidence about how to achieve better outcomes more reliably. And then we add to this recipe the power of structured networks focused on solving shared problems. Such collective action can accelerate a field's learning about any problem. Promising practices will diffuse more rapidly and are further tested and refined as others take them up. The practical knowledge that accumulates from these multiple tests of change is essential to making a reform work as it moves out into many different hands and gets taken up in many different kinds of organizational contexts. Doing this work in the context of structured, networked improvement communities provides the strongest assurance that as change scales, what is implemented is actually an improvement. Now, I'd like to go a little bit more deeply into the principles that organize this work. All right. We came to think about the work of improvement carried out through networks as organized around 6 principles. How these principles apply and unfold in any particular context may look somewhat different, but they should be clearly recognizable. To begin with, I'm going to start in the middle with what I've come to think about as the kernel feature in the overall improvement enterprise, which is you have to see the system that produces the current outcomes if you want to have a chance of improving those outcomes. There's a wonderful TED Talk a couple of years ago by Gawande, who of course is one of the leaders in the quality improvement movement in healthcare. And in this talk 2 years ago, Atul details how medicine is in the deepest crisis of its professional existence. As a field, Gawande tells us that medicine has attracted the best talent, people could not be better trained, they have extraordinary technologies and science to undergird their enterprise, all things that we aspire to, incidentally, in education. And yet, he tells us, we still witness unconscionable levels of death and disability caused by our healthcare systems, things that could be avoided. The field pays too little attention to how all of the resources it has actually must come together in the service of human betterment. Toward the end of his talk, this is the part that caught my attention, he closes with this observation: making systems work is the great task of our generation. Whether in healthcare, education, climate change, making a pathway out of poverty, this is the great task we have to solve. And at the heart of making systems work, Gawande also tells us, is the problem of complexity. The tasks medical professionals undertake today are now much more complex than ever before, and they operate in organizations that are also much more complex than ever before. His comments about complexity remind me of an observation offered by Lewis Thomas some 4 decades ago. Thomas told us that when you're confronting any complex system, you can't just step in and set about fixing it with much help of improving. You cannot meddle with one part of the complex system without causing something else to happen somewhere else that you hadn't counted on. And if you really want to fix something, you're first obliged to understand it, the whole system. Well, this view, this idea that complexity is the fundamental character of 21st century institutions, and you need the system you need to see the system if you're to have any chance of improving it. And it has this complexity has these two characters. The specific tasks we ask people to do have become more complex, and the organization in which they work to support this have equally become more complex. Well, in the context of education, unfortunately, this complexity seems largely invisible. The one-room schoolhouse, displayed here, was a simple enterprise. You had a teacher, mixed-age group of students, perhaps some chalkboards, some simple texts. Aspirations were modest, consisting of basic reading skills, a little bit of arithmetic, be able to write one's name. All that has changed. The Common Core asks students to engage in much more complex texts and ideas than ever before. We aspire that all students should command a deeper understanding of the big ideas that organize our exploding universe. The tasks we expect teachers to execute today have become consequently more complex. In my youth, I experienced round-robin reading. It was a very simple teaching task. We each read a few sentences. It went student by student around the room. If you made a mistake, the teacher corrected you. Contrast that with the kind of strategic teaching that's at the heart of something like a guided reading activity that might occur with small groups of students multiple times in any given day. Or think about the demands of using rich problems in mathematics classrooms, or guiding students through the exploration of some scientific phenomena. Each of these is a much more complex and demanding intellectual task. So education has increased task complexity. In tandem with that, the organizations of schools have become much more complex over the last several decades. We now expect teachers, for example, to mainstream in their classrooms many students who previously were segregated out or not educated at all. Likewise, we expect all teachers, regardless of subject matter taught, to be able to be responsive to the differences in students in culture and language that come into the classroom. At a most basic level, this means classrooms are more complex environments to manage than they were before. Likewise, teachers, principals, and other school leaders interact now with a vast array of staff, sometimes from inside the school district, often from other external organizations. These individuals are in schools providing supplemental programs, where they might be individual tutoring, various forms of small group response to intervention, after school and summer school programs, instructional coaches coming in areas such as mathematics, literacy, sciences, student data analysis. All of these new roles now populate our school buildings. And perhaps the most demanding of all of this are the activities associated with individual educational plans that come through state and federal special education laws. Brings another whole array of specialists into schools. Now, all of these are potentially great value in our goal and our efforts to educate all of our children well. My only point is that it has dramatically increased the complexity of the organizations in which this work is being attempted, carried out. And then there's one more part. The profession of education, as in healthcare, confronts a knowledge explosion. Educators are told today to attend to multiple forms of intelligence, difference in learning styles, cognitive science about how people learn, social psychology of research on concepts such as resilience, grit, persistence, students' mindsets. The list of new ideas is now growing at a dizzying pace. Just look at the program guide for the AERA. A set of forces, so you take all of this together, a set of forces have made schooling much more complex in terms of both the tasks we expect educators to carry out and the organizational conditions in which they work. So as in healthcare, few individual professionals, even the most intentioned and hardworking, can easily absorb and effectively respond to all of this in their daily work. So it is not surprising then that a chasm exists between what educators seek to accomplish and what they actually achieve. Yes, schools command more resources than in earlier generations, but as a field, we remain unable to orchestrate all of this to the benefit of our children. So, what happens in an environment, because we see this in lots of different sectors, when the environment is characterized by both task and organizational complexity, some common things happen. One of the things that happens is breakdowns occur. Things that are supposed to happen, services that are provided, don't happen, or they don't align with what students actually need. These kinds of breakdowns are routinely observed in complex organizations. The other consequence that occurs in complex organizations is that that complexity produces wide variability in outcomes unless one is extremely sensitive to dealing with the problem of variability. Wide variability in outcomes is a natural consequence of the creation of very complex institutions. This in turn, this complexity, also then shapes how we think about working on improvement. Many of the kinds of problems we're interested in, like minority gaps in student achievement, or the dropout rates in colleges, or where we first started, the relatively weak rates of student success through community colleges, are actually the aggregate result of many different processes playing out over time. You can't directly affect the outcome except by understanding what are the high leverage processes that are actually combining together to produce that outcome. So it means as we think about doing this work, we need to identify these high leverage problems, and we need to actually do very specific design, development, and refinement work on these key processes. I'll give you an example. In the context of our work on developmental mathematics, instruction in community colleges, we started out initially concerned about the low success rates in community colleges. But as I said, this is the consequence of many different factors operating at the same time. There's a principle in improvement science called the Pareto principle. And basically what the Pareto principle says is that across many different organizations, this generalization seems to arise, that about 80% of the variability in outcome is a result of 20% of the causes. So go try and identify those 20% of the causes and act strategically to improve those. It was that perspective that drove us to focus attention on developmental math instruction in community colleges, because arguably this is the single biggest gatekeeper to opportunity. If you don't get through this, you can't transfer to a four-year institution, you can't qualify for a vocational and technical preparation program. Back in the years when I was in Chicago working with Barbara, much of our work focused on elementary and high schools, keeping students in schools, getting them to continue along to graduate. At that point, thinking graduating high school was improving high school graduation would be a tremendous accomplishment. For those who actually got through high schools and continued their education, vast majority of them would wind up in community colleges. What I subsequently learned is that it varies from college to college, but somewhere between 60 to 70% of the students who arrive at the community college doorstep are assigned to a developmental math course. All right? Of that group, upwards of 80% will never get out. They will never complete a college-level math, never acquire college-level math credit, and every year we send 500,000 students down this pathway. got to think about how we're going to do this differently. One of the problems, again, coming out of the complexity of the institutions and the work we're trying to improve, is that there is a kind of inherent indeterminism. As you actually try to advance improvement, you don't always know how to accomplish this. You have to learn your way into improvement. You have to change things because you learn a lot as you change things about the system you're actually trying to improve. So because it's hard to predict ahead of time exactly what outcomes will ensue from any attempt to intervene, you have this kind of organizational fact of life that transmutes improvement efforts into learning to improve problems. This is where we engage disciplined inquiry. It directs you towards this design development orientation of iterative cycles of work. And the driving principle behind this is you want to learn quickly. You want to be minimally intrusive, because especially at the beginning, the things you try might not work, and you don't want to foist that on a lot of people if you can avoid it. And at every step, you want to gather some data. You want to have some empirical warrant coming back to you to say, I think we're heading in the right direction, or, geez, that didn't work. What does that mean about what we have to try next? So it's captured in this mantra of learn fast, fail fast, improve fast. How one actually starts this work on any problem in any context actually depends on three considerations. In education, we have no shortage of good ideas. Right? But the first critical question is, do we actually know how to execute on the idea? Can we take this idea and actually turn it into something that actually works in classrooms, schools, community, colleges? So the first question you have to ask yourself is, how confident are you that you can actually execute on this reform idea? The second question we have to ask ourselves is, even if you know how to execute, how much capacity do you have to actually do this work? Oftentimes, if you have a good base capacity, you can obviously work at much larger scale than if your initial capacity is quite limited. So that's the second question you have to ask, how much capacity you have to do this kind of work. And then the third is the political question, how will others see what you're bringing to them? Are you, as you go out, educators, principals, leaders of community colleges, are they ready for the changes you're bringing? Are they indifferent, or are they likely to be resistant? How you start depends on how you answer these three questions. This is a basic display, another piece of guidance coming out of improvement research. Typically, where we start in education is down here in that bottom right-hand corner. Implement wide, spread fast, which is the perfectly sensible place to start. If you know how to execute, you've got capacity, and your audience is ready for what you're bringing to them. Unfortunately, the conditions that we actually operate under most of the time are more like up in the upper left-hand corner, where we actually don't know how to execute on the idea. We may have a very good idea, but we don't really know all the details of what it takes to make it work. We have at most a limited number of people who can work on this, and we're confronting people who are indifferent and maybe sometimes outright resistant to what you're bringing to them. So how you start really depends on kind of sizing up the institution in which you're trying to work. All right. So we must learn our way into this problem, depending on where you start in that grid I just displayed, and how we actually do this work. Here now, I'd like to draw an example coming out of that second network, the Building Teacher Effectiveness Network, and one of the very specific processes that school districts, in this case was Austin School District, was working on, was how to strengthen the principal-teacher feedback conversation in the context that there were now much more rigorous teacher evaluation protocols being used in the school districts. This is a case where I had an idea that this ought to be better than it is, didn't really quite know how to execute on it, and it's going to happen in a context that is pretty contentious. That is because we're now focusing a lot of attention on teacher evaluation. So that says start really small. So it starts with one principal school with a few new teachers, to develop, can we develop a standard protocol to guide how this conversation should proceed? This work is done through what's called a Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. The plan is I've got an idea about the protocol. I make some predictions about what I think will happen if I try this thing out. I actually go do it. I collect some data. In this case, in the early stage, it's pretty simple. It's kind of like my feelings about it, and maybe I try to get some information from the couple of new teachers who experienced it. I then kind of analyzed, did this look anything like what I expected it to be? Where did it break down? What am I going to change for the next cycle? So this happens a few times inside a school. One principal, eventually several teachers. He now believes he's got a protocol that works. He feels quite confident in it. Got some data from the teachers going through it that this is a very good process. So that's the first kind of significant test. Then we go out and deliberately try to break it. You take it out to 5 principals, a number of different schools, and as soon as you take it out to more diverse contexts, predictably, it's going to fall apart someplace. In this particular case, the protocol had kind of 6 steps that orchestrated the conversation, and at the step where the principal and the teacher agree upon what the improvement priority would be that the teacher might focus on, and then what resources would be made available to support her improvement, some of the principals had difficulty with that. That part of the protocol just didn't seem to work. So we see task complexity. As this thing gets taken up by other people, the protocol's got to get more detailed because we're starting to see some of the complexity of the task. What wasn't obvious from David Kaufman's first work with this, at the first step, became really obvious as it went into more diverse hands. So the protocol then gets further detailed through these Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles, and now the 5 principals feel like this is working. We're starting to gather some data from teachers. Again, they think it's a good experience. Well, now let's take it out to a larger group. As it goes to the next step, what happens is it starts to move into high schools. And now we have, in one of these schools, there are 40 new teachers. Well, how is it one principal can't actually interact with 40 new teachers? So we have to bring other people into the process of this feedback conversation. And as soon as you bring others into the process of the feedback conversation, you confront organizational complexity. Because now you have problems of coordination and communication you have to solve if this process is going to be coherently experienced by each and every teacher inside that school. So that becomes the focus of the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles at the next level. Because the process that worked fine, as long as the number of new teachers was small, broke down as soon as the number of new teachers in a school got to be large. So how do you elaborate that process? And in this case, also a supportive set of tools, because they're actually using iPads to be able to indicate who's talked to whom and about what, so that even if I wasn't in the conversation, I'd at least have some record of what had transpired as I proceed to have my conversation with that teacher. And then now the stage they're at, they're moving to district-wide implementation, and then there's a question about a whole set of district policies as well as resources that now have to be realigned to be able to support this at scale across the district. So this is an example of a learning to improve process that starts very small but aims to produce system changes that results in a quality process being implemented reliably at scale. Now, to do this kind of work, it places a centrality on measurement. Come down this path. So let's talk about that. At base here is another one of the improvement principles. You cannot improve at scale what you can't measure. Now, we're accustomed to measuring lots of outcomes for students. But that's a little bit like if you think about the outcomes we're interested in as the result of many different processes accumulating over time, this is a bit to standing at the end of an assembly line and counting the defects coming off the line. And if you think you got too many defects at the end of the line, well, let's have 2 people count them instead of just 1. So we'll have much better data about what we're not accomplishing. Well, that actually doesn't really help you to improve. You have to go back up the line and find out, begin to figure out where these processes are breaking down, which means we have to figure out what are the critical processes. We have to get measures at that level so that we can begin to see whether if we work on intermediate targets, whether we're moving those intermediate targets, and if we move the intermediate targets, are we then actually getting more of the ultimate outcomes that we're interested in? Let me illustrate this now, these two concerns about measurement, in the context of the work we've been doing in community colleges. What the community college reform has consisted of is creating two coherent pathways to and through college-level math credit in 1 year. One's organized around college-level statistics, which you call Statway, and another one's organized around college-level course in quantitative reasoning. On the outcome side, for every student, this work is now in 55 colleges. It began in 27. For every student who's going into the statistics pathway, we're able to match them to 5 other students just like them on 44 different indicators. So we have students going in the Statway, and we have students going down the traditional sequence. So we can now compare what happens. So in this case, this sense, we are standing at the end of the process. Well, what do we know? For students who go down the traditional sequence, 6% of them acquire college-level math credits in 1 year. In these same colleges, 15% acquired college-level math credits in 2 years. That's the problem we're trying to solve right there. For the students who go down the Statway pathway, 51% of them now acquire college math credits in 1 year. This is replicated now over 2 cohorts. And so the bumper sticker description or summary of this is that we've tripled the success rate in half the time. Now you get a result like that, you think, this is great, let's go spread it. But it's only half of the students. What about the other half who still aren't succeeding? That's part of our improvement problem. What about the other half? What do we know? Well, one of the primary drivers for this work, there's 4 primary drivers: the actual design of the instructional system, initiatives around what we call productive persistence, which deal with problems of motivation and engagement, issues about embedded problems with regard to language and literacy in the curriculum and instruction, and then the 4th of which is work around supporting the professional development and advancement of teachers, since all of this is mediated through them. And notice Ann Edwards is here, and she's leading that work for us at the foundation. But I want to focus on that second driver, what we now call productive persistence. As the work was initially beginning in this area, we heard a lot about issues of motivation, concerns about student engagement, students telling us they were working hard, a whole set of things in this whole area about grit, persistence, resilience, a lot of terms that are used in this. But if this is one of our key drivers, that is, if we want students to persist more productively, to actually complete this pathway, we got to get a little bit more specific about what this thing actually is we're trying to improve. Well, so we have the voices of the teachers and students who are engaged in this work. And I want to just pull aside, how to do this work is something I learned to do with Barbara. It actually happened when we were doing the Trust in Schools book, because we had we had been out in schools, we had been observing in classrooms, we'd been watching various kinds of meetings occurring in schools, had all this very rich language about how people were talking about their work and places where improvements seemed to be happening and places where it didn't. And words about respect, trust, caring. There were a whole set of language in those conversations that had gathered our attention. And then the second step was to go over, so to pay a lot of attention to what people said. And then the second step was to say, all right, if we're working in this domain, what are the relevant theoretical frameworks that might help us understand this better? And that's that kind of, so being kind of Janus-faced, paying really close attention to how people think about their work, and then looking very carefully at, well, what theory might actually help us understand this better? So as we switch over to the theoretical frames in this area, The problem we confront is that there actually are some 40 different sub-concepts that are published in the literature, broadly under this domain of motivation and engagement. But nobody can carry 40 different ideas around in their head. And this is a place where the organization of the Academy is actually a problem, because part of what we get rewarded for in the Academy is to differentiate ourselves from others. So we want to find important but very narrow differences about how this concept is a little different from that concept. But at that level, the scientific knowledge typically isn't very useful because it's just too fine-grained. So one of the tasks at this point is how to pull this back together, how to synthesize this work and say, what are the core ideas that are really embedded in this work that if we worked on, these are the ones that might actually help us with students persisting more productively through that. So in part of making the choices, you look at things where there's clearly evidence that the particular sub-concepts are malleable. That is particularly so experimental evidence that somebody somewhere has actually been able to change students' mindsets on these things is really key. And that helps to bring this back into the 5 core ideas. And here are the 5 that organize this work on productive persistence, with the bulk of the work we've done to date really focused on the bottom 3. The mindsets about the potential to learn math. That's shifting students from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. Mindsets about the value of math, rather than putting them back through math that they've seen before and keep doing it over and over again, changing what the content of the mathematics looks like to be able to convince them that this is actually worth learning. And then this whole issue about belonging uncertainty and the importance of creating very strong social connections at the classroom and college level. So we have now a conceptual framework, but if we're actually going to do this work, we've got to measure this. So this becomes the next task, what we now call practical measurement. In that literature that I've described, one can find over 900 survey items that have been used by somebody in studying this problem. Well, one thing you know for sure is we're not going to administer a survey with 900 survey items. And more to the point, this isn't like a one-time research study. We're really talking about the kind of information that should be routinely collected from every student. It's got to fit in the web of the day-to-day work of instruction. Well, that imposes a real practical constraint. We want to get this data on day 1. How much time can we actually get from that first class each semester? After some conversations with our faculty colleagues, we come up with this idea, the maximum is 3 minutes. That's all you're going to get, is 3 minutes. So you work back from that. If you got 3 minutes, knowing something about surveys, that's about 25 questions at most you can ask in 3 minutes. So then that drives you to the question of, what's the 25 most important things to ask if I only have 3 minutes? I'm not talking about how do I measure best any particular subconstruct. I'm really now at the level of saying, what's the 25 best individual items to ask? Well, how do we then use this information? Well, part of the theory of change in this is that it's very important to start strong. I mean, in some ways, this is a general change phenomena. It's very important for anyone to experience success early on as a change occurs. It's important for the students to experience success as they move into these new pathways. And I'd also say it's important for the faculty who are now teaching different content in different ways to also experience success early on. The Starting Strong package is one part of what we do in productive persistence. So if we're really trying to change the experiences that occur in the first couple of weeks, is there any evidence that any of this seems to be working? So we have a set of, these are 4 of the questions we ask in that set of 25. Actually, some of these are clusters of questions we ask. And we get it data on day 1, we get it again on week 4. What do we see? Students' reports about their interest in math has increased over that 4-week period of time. There's been a substantial decrease in the students who hold a fixed mindset about math, which means many more of them now have a growth mindset toward their work. Anxiety is down, and as are reports about belonging uncertainty. This is an interesting process of working because we can look at these data and we can say, well, the data seems to suggest we're heading in the right direction with the Starting Strong package. But the Starting Strong package is also providing us evidence back that the things we're measuring actually seem amenable to change. And that is the dynamic of improvement. You're changing things, you're measuring things, and you're actually going back and forth between them to guide what you might do next. Because maybe the changes didn't work, or maybe the measurement system isn't as good as we would like it to be. All right, so completing this map about what we should work on and how we should work on it. The goal in this kind of work, as I mentioned before, is it's all about getting quality reliably at scale. It's not just at the most basic level, when you first start, is can we get this idea to work anywhere? But the real questions we have to answer is what will it take to make it work in many other contexts as it moves out into diverse hands and diverse organizational settings. So, and which you saw in that the principal feedback conversation. So this takes us to the last of the principles, even though it's number 2 on our list, that variation in performance is the problem to solve. The question isn't what works, because what works is about a kind of an average question. The question we have to solve when you're trying to get work on quality reliably at scale is how do you get something to work as it moves out into the hands of diverse teachers? They're engaging somewhat different populations of students, and they're working in different organizational contexts. The goal is just not to move a bell-shaped curve a little bit to the right. It's to move it far to the right, and especially to pull in that lower tail of the distribution. That goal drives you to constantly look at where you're succeeding and where you're not. And where you're not, what are you going to do next? So even though we have this 50+% success rate, we know we're not succeeding for all students. One of the questions we ask on day 1 is this question directly focused on belonging uncertainty. How often, if ever, do you wonder, maybe I don't belong here? Turns out this question is the single strongest predictor of whether or not students will persist to the end of the semester. If they answer never, hardly ever, or sometimes, has little effect on dropping out. If they answer frequently and always, the probability of dropping out escalates, and it is especially high for African Americans. Belonging uncertainty and stereotype threat. It's operating in our pathways. This is directed at us now. Even though we worked on the Starting Strong package and we think there's some good things in it, it's still not good enough. What are we going to do to try to further reduce the influence of belonging uncertainty? That's the work we're now engaged in. We look at variability for all these different characteristics of students. We're also looking at variation across all the colleges. The 45-degree angle line would be if there was no improvement occurring in the college. That's where you expect their results to show up. The broken line is where they would be if they were tripling the success rate in half the time. And you notice that most of the colleges, 18 out of 19, this is Statway, cluster around the broken line. But there's one down here that does not. So we have a failure. Why? That becomes another critical part of the investigation. There's something we should be able to learn about this one place that it didn't work that might actually help us get better as this moves out to more places. All right, last of the 6 principles. This idea of tapping the power of networks. Everyday principals, teachers, and educational leaders are regularly experimenting with new approaches, seeking to improve outcomes for their students. Given the size and scope of American education, we're talking about experimentation occurring on a grand scale. For just about any question any of us might pose, chances are there's somebody out there somewhere who's already thought about this, done something really quite good, but we don't know who they are, we don't know exactly what they've done, nor do we know where they're located. From this angle of view, the size of the education enterprise, it's actually anomalous that we're not seeing wider scale educational improvement. It goes back to the problem that I mentioned earlier. We have failed to organize, refine, and build on lessons because we're not structured in ways that allow us to accomplish this goal. In other contexts, networks are now forming to attack and solve problems that were once thought to be quite difficult and in some cases intractable. These networks, deliberately structured, represent a new organizational form designed to enable rapid collective action on solving complex problems. Imagine if the kind of vibrant networks that are now emerging across the physical sciences, biological sciences, they're emerging in healthcare as well. Imagine if these kinds of vibrant networks were used to solve problems in education. They could harness the field's many current improvement efforts and transform them into collective knowledge building. Fortunately, there are some good things happening already. Work around professional learning communities, communities of practice, faculty inquiry groups. Typically, these communities coalesce around a common problem. As individual participants share their experiences, they stimulate insights, among others. The network science idea recognizes this collective energy as a source of learning, but then it takes it one step further by bringing scientific discipline as to how plausible change ideas are further detailed, tested, refined against evidence. Network science aims to exploit the social intelligence of a group and how that social intelligence can accelerate not just individual learning, but a whole profession's capacity to learn and improve. If we did this, we would truly enliven the better nature of the wisdom of crowds. Together, we can accomplish more than even the best of us can accomplish alone. I'm going to just skip over a couple of things and jump right to the end. That is, if I can get there. Yeah. All right. As we've been working on this, a few folks have said to us, well, this sounds like a new paradigm. And having lived through the paradigm battles of the 1970s, just the thought of that word frightens me. But I'd heard it a few times, so I thought, well, I'll just go look it up. And what is actually a paradigm? Well, according to the Webster's Dictionary, paradigm is a group of ideas, a theory, about how something should be done, made, or thought about. Well, yeah, this is a group of interrelated ideas about a very practical purpose. Purpose being, how do we accelerate learning in and through practice to improve? So, in a sense, there is something that you might call a network improvement paradigm, where we used to embrace implementing fast. This approach now shifts us to learning fast to implement well, where empirical research has focused attention on mean differences between two groups captured in a standard effect size. This focuses our analytic attention on the sources of variability in performance and what are we going to do about it. Where what we've talked about before is we've used this phrase, what works, what we're really after now is how to make something work. The gold standard becomes replicability. Can we get quality outcomes to occur over and over again, different hands, in different organizational settings, where historically we've had this very dysfunctional debate between, well, given all the complexity I've described, what we've got to do is script it. So that's how we're going to deal with the complexity. Or you flip entirely to the other side, which says, well, because it's all so complex, everything's unique, and everybody's got to figure it out on their own. This way of thinking says, we've got to identify those high-leverage processes, because when you're doing complex work, you have to figure out how to support people to do that work well, and really make those the target of improvement. So how do we better support complex work? Where historically, we've prized individual autonomy as the highest value. What now becomes the highest value, to solve the kinds of problems we're confronting, we have to work together. We can accomplish more that way than any one of us can operating in isolation. Where we have this knowledge, where we have this language about researchers, they're the ones who really know the stuff, and then there are users who do things. We now have a language where we try to bring people together. We join as improvers around complex problems. And the goal of this work is to produce what people have actually started to call practice-based evidence. That is the kind of evidence you need about practice to attain quality outcomes reliably at scale. To close, the spirit of what we're about is actually captured in a wonderful quote from Don Berwick. The problem that is managing quality is not just an intellectual endeavor. It's a pragmatic one. The point is not just to know what makes things better or worse. It is to actually make things better. And how we use inquiry to accomplish this. So if I were to capture this on a bumper sticker, albeit a long bumper sticker, it's about learning fast, to implement well, to achieve quality reliably at scale. That is what I think anchors and organizes this work. And on that, I will stop.
Oh, thank you very much for an outstanding job. Just outstanding. That's just great. Will you take a question?
Yeah, that's
okay.
all right. I'm going to make sure Lisa.
We have just a few moments for a question. There are mics back there if anybody wants to come. Give Tony a chance to take a drink of water. That was quite something. Do we have a question out there? Yes, please. Can you stand up and use a real big voice, please? Yes.
The question was about the human capital requirements to engage this kind of work effectively. One of the things I forgot to mention is that there's an interesting side benefit of starting up in that upper left-hand corner of starting small. When you have a good idea, but you don't quite know how to execute on it, you have limited capacity and you have people who are maybe doubtful about the work, as was the case in Austin. When you start there, you wind up doing three things at the same time. You're learning about how to go from the idea to something that might actually work. So there's technical knowledge, know-how being built. And in this case, there was a protocol that was being developed and eventually how they were going to structure their communication systems and so on. So this technical knowledge is being built. The first people who do it and actually experience some success in it, they've developed some expertise in it. So in that particular case, David Kaufman was actually a resource to the next group of principals who began to take this on. And David has now become an evangelizing leader for the work because he's experienced success in it. So that when individuals actually experience success in this work, you're both building their human capital and you're developing their will to bring others into the work, which is very different than what we normally do when we ask people to actually take on reforms that don't work. We tend to frustrate them and we tend to undermine any agency rather than building agency for improvement. So there is actually quite a detailed theory of change that deals with both technical knowledge, human resource development, and generating will to grow this work.
Yes, please.
I'm Sharon Derry from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I'd like for you to say a few words about the practical steps involved in building these partnerships and how we can build this kind of knowledge into the training for our doctoral students.
All right. Well, in each one, we've initiated 2 networked improvement communities, and what we've begun to do now is start to work with other organizations that are trying to build similar enterprises. So each one of these is, in essence, can be thought of as like a mega case where we're now trying to learn, as we do this and others, how do you initiate some activity like this well? In the case of and we have 2 very different experiences in the 2 networks that we initiated. In the case of the community college program, we did a lot of conversations early on with faculty, community college leaders, relevant people who are doing research in this area, and we were constantly working on a working theory of the problem as well as this working theory of improvement. And then once we had a framework in place, we then invited participants, if you want to work on this problem and you're interested in working on it in this kind of framework, that's how the colleges joined into it. This had the advantage that we got a lot of work across many different domains occurring rapidly, but we orchestrated more of the upfront work. In the case of the B10 work, we brought teams together from 3 different districts, and there we started in a very different way. We said they were working in this general area of problems with new teachers, and we want you to identify, through this residential summer institute of a week we had, actually it was 3 days, we want you to identify something you're going to go home on Tuesday and try to change. So plot out some plan, do, study, act cycles and actually start doing the improvement work. Well, we've had different experiences in the 2. The community college program has gotten a lot farther faster in terms of impact on students, but the B10 one has been interesting in that this orientation toward quality improvement has gone deep in the districts. Actually, in all 3 of the places we've worked, and it's an interesting little story, and I'll stop. When we brought the districts together for the Initiating Institute, many of these were central office leaders, and they're accustomed, urgency of change, we got to do something, we got to figure out what it is, we got to roll it out across the whole district. And we're saying to them, well, think about an idea, go try it on Tuesday and do it in one place. This was like a kind of huge leap of faith because it's just not the way we work. This is a huge cultural change. But they tried it, and virtually all of the individuals who've been part of it, and many of the people whom they in turn have recruited, have now begun to take this discipline of quality improvement out to other problems that they're trying. So it has begun to affect a change in the way people think about their work. So the short answer is there's probably more than one way to start these, and it's a question we want to learn more about what are the pros and cons of different ways of starting. In terms of doctoral students, well, we've started to think about this problem because we've had actually faculty from a number of colleges of education say, well, this is really interesting. We want to engage some of this kind of work in our programs. But some of this is knowledge of, so we can communicate a lot about what we've learned from various other sources and make that available as we are in this open online course. But this is actually a practice of doing. And it's a fairly complex practice, and you only learn about it through doing it, and you best learn about doing it through somebody who's a bit more expert at it than you are. Now, the problem we're confronting is, as a field, this expertise doesn't exist in education. That's why we went to healthcare. Interestingly, when the healthcare people started, they went to industry to import the guidance as the coaching guidance. So we are beginning to think about this issue about what kind of supports we could provide to colleges of education where faculty might want to actually start to introduce this program. But it's not just, the one thing we're sure of, it's not just a set of materials, it's also what a learning environment, set of resources might look like that people can learn the practice of doing improvement research. So that's a long answer, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I think we're pretty close to on time. Oh, there was one more. I'm sorry. Okay, one more.
Hi. One request, one question.
Yeah.
Would you please put the list of 6 principles back up? I didn't get a chance to capture that. But my question is about the improved or the network improvement communities. I wasn't sure I heard very much about how you are connecting those different communities that are attempting improvement to one another. Is doing so through technology and so forth part of your eventual concept?
Well, we start with face-to-face residential institutes, typically 3 or 4 days, because a big part of this is making the human connections, and maybe we're old-fashioned, but we actually think people being in the same space together is actually very productive for that. For each of the networks, well, the Community College Network has an annual forum where we try to bring everybody back together now. The B10 one was meeting 3 times a year as a group. So there's some face-to-face work. We are using web-based tools to support virtual communities. So as this Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles are going on, there are conference calls every week or every other week with teams about what have you tried, what have you learned, in which we're trying to get people to share what they've learned. We now have some online tools where the PDSA cycles that individual faculty have done are being posted. One of the norms, new norms we're trying to create is that you build on what others have already tried and learned. Now, that's kind of a basic norm in science. You know, it's like why we do literature reviews, because you build on what, but it actually isn't a norm in practice. We tend to operate in practice as if nobody has ever thought about the problem that I want to now work on or has learned anything that might actually be useful. So at least I can start in a different place than he or she did. So we're trying to build up these resources so that you can see all of the things that other faculty have tried, what problem they worked on, what they tried, what happened as a result of that, so that you might be able to start in a somewhat more advanced place than if you didn't have access to that knowledge. But it is also, it is this culture of being an improvement community that we are deliberately trying to foster through the work.
Well, with that, and we're all about improvement, innovation, and practice and policy, thank you so much for an absolutely fabulous talk. Can we please all give a hand? Thank you.